Before the COVID-19 restrictions came into effect, Ellen and I were teaching a Bible series in our Good News clubs, and I was using the same series in a number of schools weekly. And the series was about the later part of Paul's life as a missionary, dealing with his third missionary journey and things that happened right after that as well. And I wanted to take the time to share a little bit of this story with you. Just before we came to this particular story, I'm sharing, we just found in Acts 27, we were prevented from going back into the schools and from having our regular clubs. So this is a lesson that, the first lesson that I was working on to have in an online format so that it could be shared with some of the children who were following along the story of Paul's life as a missionary. One of the Bible verses that had been shared with them was Acts chapter 1 verse 8, where the Lord Jesus told his friends to wait in Jerusalem because they would receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on them, and they would be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And that's what we can see taking place in Paul's life from his time of his conversion right through to he had finished his race. We can see it was his goal always to be a witness. And I'm going to jump into Acts chapter 27, which in my case on my screen here is going to be my fourth lesson in this series about Paul's life. And we come to a ship. So for some of you, perhaps you remember the context here. Paul is sailing for Rome. He's in the company of at least Luke and some other friends as well. We know that Aristarchus is there from Ephesus. And before we go on to look at the details of how this journey pans out, I'm going to show you this quick map of the region. You can just about see my mouse pointer hovering there around Caesarea. Paul has been a prisoner in Caesarea for 2 years, and his case has been tried in front of Felix the governor, and then the next governor Festus, even King Agrippa and Bernice. And through all of these occasions, Paul has been an effective witness. This has been one kind of season in his life where he's had time to talk to these important, prominent people. And in fact, for Felix and Drusilla, he's had extra time to talk to them. And God has guided Paul to talk to specific things to those people. Every person's situation is going to be unique and individual. And when it comes to witnessing to others, we probably will find that as well. That God maybe will guide us in what to say and how we say it in each situation differently. On every occasion, Paul was a witness by sharing what he knew. So he shared his story a number of occasions, his life of how it had been changed and transformed by coming to know Jesus. When he was talking to Felix and Drusilla, there were three things in particular he was talking about. He was talking about righteousness and self-control and God's judgment. Perhaps that was very fitting for their circumstances or their situation. If you did want to find out more about that, you could look at the online Good News Club lesson number 3, in which if you go to cefsligo.com and go to the Good News Club page and type in the password Good News, you'll get access to those other lessons. But we're coming here to a place that's not marked even on our map. Somewhere on the coast there's a town called Adramyttium. It's a port where Paul is going to sail from with Luke, and it must be close to Caesarea, although I don't see it on the map there. They do stop off in Sidon for a period of time, but then they head on the sheltered side of Cyprus, and after a little while they end up in the port of Myra, and I think that's where they are when we join them in this particular picture. We find here the Roman commander called Julius, who's a centurion. He's part of the Caesar's imperial regiment, or what you call the Augustan cohort. So he's very prominent and important official. And in this particular place, In Myra, they change boats. Whatever they were in before, they're now moving into a cargo ship. It has come from the north coast of Africa. It's an Alexandrian cargo ship. It has stopped off here in Myra and they're heading straight to Rome. So Paul, the soldier, other prisoners are put on board the cargo ship. And there's quite a significant crew as well, so it must be a very large ship to have quite a large crew. It probably looks nothing like this picture. I suspect this is way too small. It's always nice to analyze these scenes and see what they've got right and what they maybe have got wrong. Seagulls, maybe. Size ship, probably not. Viking colors, I don't know. But there they are getting on board. The nice thing is that Paul is able to visit with some friends when he's in this port, and I presume they give him things to help him on this journey. Although he's a prisoner, he's given a certain amount of leeway because he's an important Roman citizen, and that's as far as it goes in terms of the centurion Julius's estimation of Paul. We'll find out that in a minute. I also have the Bible passage here. Hopefully it's visible. Don't know if my font is large enough. But I'm going to point out a few parts of this. So we find them in verse 6, they're put on board this particular ship. Verse 7, we find the journey from this particular port of Myra heading to Rome, but they can't quite go straight there because the weather conditions are against them. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go farther, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous, because even the fast was already over. This is the Day of Atonement, the first of the special Jewish feasts that God's people were to observe. It would be round about the end of October. It was already over. Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. I guess that makes sense. I mean, what does the centurion know about Paul and his experience of being a seasoned traveler? The centurion is trusting the seamen, the people who are used to sailing, and they decide to put in a little bit further along the coast to find a better harbour for the winter for that season. So they're hoping to reach a place called Phoenix, which is a port that will give access to the northwest and the southeast. But trouble arrives. Was Paul speaking in a prophetic manner when he gave this advice about loss of cargo and loss of people? We don't know that for sure. Perhaps he was just speaking from the great experience he had of sailing on the Mediterranean Sea. We find that when they do actually leave the shore, they leave the shore because there's a gentle southerly breeze and they think the conditions are nice for sailing to the next port, but they're not expecting what happens. Let me just jump back up to the map here to show you quickly where they are. So they're here on Crete. They have sailed on the sheltered, the leeward side of the island of Crete. They've come around to the port of Fair Havens and they're trying to head further west. It doesn't really look like a very long distance to sail to get to where they're going. They're just going to the western coast of Crete, not very far away, and they're not expecting trouble. Well, this is when trouble strikes. And I guess I'm seeing a parallel as well to the conditions that we have around us at the moment. COVID-19 has been something that's in a sense unexpected. I'm sure this scenario has played out in people's minds different occasions, but when it actually comes to become a reality, it is like something unexpected. I think each of us will deal with this issue. It'll affect each of us in different ways. Some will be affected from their normal working operations, and that in itself will bring stress and pressure. And others will be affected with the physical nature of this disease, those who acquire it, and others are affected in their mental state as they are perhaps in a vulnerable position physically, and they're doing their utmost to be kept safe from this virus. So different people have different stresses as they approach this condition. But I see parallels in this story of Paul and what happens next to how people find themselves when they face this struggle that comes with the coronavirus. We find that after they've left Fair Havens and they're out to sea, that is when the storm strikes. It says that it's a northerly wind that kicks up and that pushes them away from the coast. They cannot sail into the wind because it is so strong. It says, when the south wind blew gently, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, but soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulties to secure the ship's boat. This seems to be like the first day of the storm, or pretty soon into it. So they're protecting the resources they have on their ship as best they can. You could say they're battening down the hatches, which is a sailing term, I believe. And they're protecting their lifeboat. In a sense, it's almost like the reactions that governments first had whenever coronavirus became a problem. They were looking at the simple ways to protect people. They were looking at social distancing before it came to the extent of isolation and so on. Verse 17, after hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Another translation puts this that they were just securing the lifeboat. And then, fearing that they would run aground on Syrtis, they lowered the gear, which is kind of like a sea anchor, to steady the ship, and still they were being driven along. We come to day 2 in this case, verse 18. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. So this is the first step of actively dealing with the storm, putting those things off the ship that they can easily get rid of. They're trying to preserve their life, their well-being, so they get rid of the cargo that's causing them trouble. They will lose revenue, they'll lose their financial position. I guess a response of governments around the world has been to see how can we do to support people financially. Ultimately, it will mean problems with recession and financial debt that is owed at a government level, but it is a reaction to the storm that we're facing. We're on to the third day now. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. It's interesting the phrase that's used there, with their own hands. And what is the ship's tackle? So these are the necessary pieces of equipment to run the ship effectively. So whatever about losing this particular trip's cargo, they're now losing important parts. It's disrupting their normal way of managing this asset, which is the ship. And I guess in the world today, we'll find situations like that too. Not only is there the large scale financial disruption, but people's individual ways of living their lives and how they manage their job, their social contacting, all these things are being disrupted. It's having this personal impact, just like it was on the ship's crew and the owner of the ship. They were being affected as they threw off their own equipment with their own hands. And I guess we are taking as much personal responsibility to work through this storm as we can. That was verse 19. Verse 20. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. I think it's quite interesting the way the writer, who is Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke and wrote the book of Acts, these are his words. All hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. I think he's being quite humble in this. He's presenting his position that he felt as if they had no longer had any hope in this particular storm. They were just at the mercy of what the storm would bring. And there's a truth in that too when it comes to the COVID-19 crisis. We are powerless to act personally. There are individuals who are doing their best medically. There are those researchers who are looking for vaccines, who are looking at ways to alleviate these problems. But on an individual level, we're kind of powerless. We're just being carried along by what the virus is doing. There's a contrast here in the next few verses, and this is where, I guess, in every situation, God wants to make the difference. And we can see God making such a definite difference here in the life of Paul. Verse 21, since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. I love the phrasing in the middle of that. How does Paul represent this God of his who has sent an angel, a messenger with this news to him? How does he represent him to the people who are all about? There's a large number of crew on this ship, and he's standing and addressing them. They're in a condition of have been so worried about this problem they're facing, they've not even been eating for a number of days. And here's how Paul identifies him. He says, the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. So he's presenting that his life is in God's hands, the one to whom he belongs and the one that he worships. So it's not someone that he's trusting in because that person has got the power to keep him safe, like trusting in an insurance company because your wealth is protected because you've got a guarantee with that particular company, or trusting in the actions of government because you can trust what the government is doing. He's not just saying he trusts in this God because he belongs to God, but then he goes on to say the one whom he worships. So now he's presenting the real relationship, that he gives honor and praise and thanks and glory and all these aspects of worship that we bring to God. Paul brings these to this God to whom he belongs. So I just thought it was nice that there was two aspects of presenting God to these people. He is part of God's family, and also he loves God. He brings his worship to him willingly. There are many other accounts in scriptures about people going on voyages. Maybe you're thinking of Jonah in the ship. In Jonah's life there has a testimony to the sailors, but it comes across in a different fashion. And those sailors are praying to all sorts of gods to try and find safety and rescue in the violent storm they faced. I don't know what the people in this ship are doing. We know that the ship was from Alexandria. Did they follow their own way of seeking God in that country? We know that there were Romans on board. They had many gods of their own to seek. And yet we've got at least one witness that seems to be the only one who's standing up with hope in his life. And because he's doing that, I guess he's being noticed and his life is being a witness. Whatever words he says, he's being a witness by how he responds to this storm that's all around him as well. Verse 25. So take heart, men. These are the words of Paul. Take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. It's not quite the end of the account. Paul has given these words of hope that God has given him this message that not one of them will be hurt. And will the centurion listen? Because the last time when Paul gave his advice, the centurion had no reason to listen to Paul. And it made me wonder what has been happening during the course of this voyage. There are a certain number of days here we're not told about. I think something has been changing in the centurion's attitude towards Paul, and that comes about because something is seen in Paul's life that makes the centurion listen to him. We'll find out where that happens as we read the next part of the passage. Verse 27, when the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms, which, if I hover over my notes here, click on that, it says about 120 feet, so a fathom is about 2 meters or 6 feet. A little farther on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms, so it's becoming more shallow. We're not told what the draft of the particular ship is, but the sailors were fearing, verse 29, and fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. We find immediate action here on the part of the soldiers. Their commander, the centurion, has seen something in Paul's life that is making him agree with this strategy, this plan going forward, that they must trust themselves to what Paul is saying, who ultimately is God's and who worships God. And so the centurion is putting his hope here. I don't know what his own personal thoughts are, attitudes, but he's seeing a way to get through this problem. Here's the next point of witness for Paul among all these strangers. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. I guess this reminds us of the Lord's Supper in some respects. Paul is honoring God. I don't know what else he's sharing with the people at this time, but he's encouraging them to eat, and he breaks bread in their presence. But he gives thanks to God through all of this. He's pointing their thoughts and their directions to the one who is in control. And I think that's something that's happening in many places around the world at the moment through this COVID-19 problem. Many people who have their trust in God are pointing others in the direction of acknowledging Him. Easter is a wonderful time to do that. And over the next few days, people will be directed to think again of God who came into this world, who gave His life and has the power to take it back again, and the wonderful message of Easter. Paul took the bread, he put their focus on God as he gave thanks for the food, and he reassured them that their hope would be in God, and that is God's plan all along, that our hope would be in Him and in nothing else. So these things in the boat were stripped away, the things they depended on for their financial livelihood, the thing they were depending on for their security in the seas, even that was going to be taken away from them. Verse 37, we find we were in all 276 persons in the ship. Such a large number, and God is so gracious in saying to Paul that they would all be kept safe. When they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Now, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then, hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape, because we know that punishment in these days for prisoners being lost to their captors were very severe for those in charge of minding the prisoners. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. It's the Paul's arrival on the beach of Malta. So if we take a quick look at this map here, they had been attempting to get just to the west part of Crete, but for 14 days they were blown off course and they found themselves just ending up at Malta. Such a huge distance they've travelled, and they've had no control during this time, but they've been pointed now by Paul to the one who's been in control all along. And I think, this story probably finishes effectively with them landing on the beach safely and building the fire to warm themselves. They're given a warm welcome by the islanders of Malta, and as a fire is built, we know the story of how a snake, a viper, a poisonous snake, comes out of the driftwood that they're gathering to make the fire and latches onto Paul's hand. And as in many cultures, there is a perception that there is justice somewhere, but they don't know the source of that justice. So often they point to particular gods or goddesses who provide justice in the world, and they're saying that this man must have been guilty of being a murderer. He escaped the sea, but now he's not escaping justice. But when they see that Paul is not affected by the poisonous snake, they then switch completely to thinking that Paul is a god. And what a wonderful time Paul has on the island of Malta for 3 months, explaining to them who is in control of all things and showing his justice and his righteousness and his mercy. And the islanders have an opportunity to learn, as do the crew of the ship, the 276 that arrived safely on that island. What a difference will this have made in their life, not expecting to be on Malta, isolated, separated from everyone else for this long period of time. 3 months to focus and concentrate on the teaching of Paul and what God was revealing through him. And perhaps for some of us, this time of COVID-19 is a time for us to take a break from other pressures and stresses that are on our lives, and to seek for God to speak into our lives, to help us to learn more, to depend on him, to grow in faith and knowledge, to become more like the Lord Jesus as we spend time with him as well. I hope this story from the life of Paul, you found it interesting. I love the whole book of Acts. I love these chapters. One of my favorites is Acts chapter 20. I love the way Paul teaches things to the Ephesian leaders. You'll find that in one of the Good News Club Bible lessons that's online somewhere. So I'm going to leave you with that for now. Thank you for listening, and talk to you again.